Hello, everyone, and welcome to OST Live, a weekly broadcast on blockchain, branded tokens, and token economies. We feature weekly guests on this podcast to discuss the latest in blockchain and the current projects that they are working on. And with us today, we have Christian Kameir. He is managing partner of Sustany Capital. Today we're going to be discussing non-fungible tokens. We're going to be discussing the difference between ERC 721, which most of you must have heard by now, and introducing ERC 1155. But first, let's welcome Christian to the podcast. Christian, welcome to OST Live.
Hey, Jose, how are you?
Pretty good. So before we get into talking about fungibility and ERC 721, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You previously were involved in the merger of a couple of the earliest ISPs in the early 2000s, and you're currently an official member of the Forbes Finance Council. So can you tell us about your background before Sustany and what led you to blockchain?
Sure. Initially in the 80s, I was trying to become a software developer. That was during the Atari days and whatnot, but then ended up going to law school. When I came out of law school, the dot-com bubble has just started to begin, and so I ended up being general counsel for one of the very early internet service providers. I was writing a doctor thesis on the topic of telecommunication, number regulation, and this was tightly interwoven at the time. So incidentally, I was one of the foremost experts in this space, which is to say really nothing, because there were only like a handful of people around at the time that understood this. And we got very lucky selling our internet service provider in 2000 at the beginning, before NASDAQ hit its all-time high. So at that point in time, we merged with the largest European ISP, and that allowed me then to retire from the law, move to Southern California, and enter tech venture capital, and been doing this for quite some time. The reason why I love this particular blockchain topic is because what I realized probably a decade ago is that we never ended up actually building the World Wide Web. What we are looking at right now is really the commercial web. Most people don't really have access to the World Wide Web. You just get a filtered version of it, filtered by all the usual suspects that you know, your Googles, your Facebooks, and a handful of other entities out there. So it's highly centralized, and you don't really get to the information in an unfiltered way unless you install a very specific browser and you kind of circumvent all this particular content. So that had bothered me for quite some time, because if you look at the original works, specifically from people such as Tim Berners-Lee, who wrote the HTML content that we now understand to have formed the World Wide Web specifically, then you realize that the initial ideas was really to connect people with particular knowledge and evolve knowledge and share information in a useful way. And by introducing all these commercial companies that we have now that filter this content for you, you really never achieve this particular goal. So one of my main motivations is really to see all the missing protocols being built that will then facilitate this actual knowledge sharing. So that's why I'm particularly in this space. And so I started writing about this about 10 years ago. And incidentally, a lot of the things that are being built on top of the blockchain are truly what's going to help facilitate this particular purpose, what I call building the actually Web 1.0, the World Wide Web 1.0.
Great. So what does that mean? You mentioned building protocols for knowledge sharing. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So right now, if you do a Google search, right, 99% of the content that is visible to you, it really has some form of commercial intent. If I'm an author of true content, if I'm a researcher on something, let's say I try to publish something on protein synthesis to attack some form of cancer, you will have no chance in hell to actually come up on the first page of Google for that particular topic, because needless to say, there's thousands of SEO copy that are vying for your eyeballs. And so there's no real effective way of filtering this right now, because the intent of Google specifically is obviously to make you click on as many ads as possible, because they're not a search engine, they're a marketing company. So here, the specific example would be, once we have identity protocols, you can actually associate that particular content to a particular person, right? So right now, a lot of the content that you're seeing is bot generated or just by outsourced content farms in third world countries that really just have the purpose of having you click on these particular links to, at the end of the day, get to some commercial endpoint. So if there was, let's say, make it very simple, a filter for you, an app, and a plugin in your browser that would just allow you to filter for, hey, what's actually original content? Where can I actually drill down to content where I can identify the author and his or her qualification? And there's a couple of developments underway, incidentally also from CERN, where the original HTML programs and protocols were developed.
Good. Is this where Sustany comes in? Does Sustany help these projects focus on those protocols with funding and resources to build their product and protocol?
Yeah, so we have been in the space for quite some time, as you probably know. As you know, we run the local meetups groups and have been doing this for Ethereum for the past 4 years so far. And we are very close to all the actual protocol developments, which is the most important part. So what do I mean by that? So what blockchains really are, and a lot of people use this term incorrectly, is it's a software stack to let you build value transfer protocols. And I'm going to explain in a minute what this means. So the World Wide Web is really made up of a couple of protocols, as you know. So you got SMTP to exchange emails. You got voice over IP, which we're talking across now. And those are all free open source protocols that enabled a whole lot of new developments to where now there's as many emails being sent every day than postal mail. Snail mail was an entire existence of human beings. And before there was an effective SIP protocol, so a voice over IP protocol, you had to pay for the minute. And the call that we're doing right now entirely for free would have been pretty costly and limited to a couple of entities that would be able to afford this particular technology. But what hasn't happened is we haven't built all the other protocols that allow you to transfer value. And so initially, what we're closely focused on now is building MOIP, building money over IP protocols. A lot of people are already using this term, have been using this term almost for a decade by now. But really what it means at the end of the day is that you have a true peer-to-peer value exchange. Right now, this is really still somewhat cumbersome because you still have to buy a cryptocurrency, quote unquote. It's not really a term that I cherish, but everybody's using it, so let's use it for the time being. And then from there, I can send it to you. But at the end of the day, if you actually want to pay for something in the real world, IRL, right, then you typically will still have to go out through some fiat gateway because most merchants right now don't accept this, right? So they won't take Bitcoin from you to pay for your daily wares and your daily groceries. And that's our narrow focus for the time being. At the same point in time, we're looking towards all the steps that are required to do so. So what I mean by this specifically is one of the projects we've been working way on for some time now is that we have a true money over IP solution that's opaque to the user, because you and I are now talking using a certain protocol, the standard initialization protocol, the voice over IP protocol in this particular implementation. But you and I really don't care if that's the protocol. It's just what makes it possible. At the same point in time, you don't care if you pick up your Apple iPhone and it's using TDMA or CDMA. You just care about the fact that this is a good phone call and it doesn't cost you an arm and a leg. So same holds true actually for MOIP, right? For money over IP. You shouldn't care whether or not you need to first buy Bitcoin or any of the other cryptocurrencies and then transfer it. You just want to exchange value. And one of the fallacies, I think, is that a lot of people in the space are trying to educate their users to accept cryptocurrencies and start to talk about cryptocurrency. That's kind of a futile effort, and you don't need to, because you and I, for example, have been indoctrinated to using the US dollar. Right? And it's like a language of money transfer, a language of exchange, a language in the course of human interaction that would be very hard to then change, because even if I present you with a value in Bitcoin in your head, you will always transfer it back to USD, or if I am in another country, let's say in Germany, I will translate it back to the euro, right? Because I've been indoctrinating into this particular language of trade. So what we're working on, that this money over IP protocol is actually becoming a standard in the background, just like you will pick up your phone to make a phone call not knowing that it's using TDMA or CDMA. You'll be able to use your credit card at a point of sale terminal, and you don't know that in the background it's translating it to some form of cryptocurrency. And that, at the end of the day, is what I truly understand to be money over IP. And then we'll get to all the additional non-fungible tokens that we'll talk about that will help facilitate this particular transaction because they're adding more value. So I'm going to stop talking because you know me by now. I can talk about this topic without for an hour.
So just to summarize a few highlights and key points, current protocols today are focused on or can only provide transfer of messages as a form of communication, and the blockchain provides transfer of value. But the end goal is that it shouldn't matter which cryptocurrency or underlying blockchain product is used, as long as it's something that works and is efficient as far as costs.
Right, because at the end of the day, and that's the main point I'm trying to get across, is open and decentralized blockchain stacks allow you to build value transfer protocols. And that is really the power of blockchain. And I always also like to point out at this point in time, there's 90% of the time when people use this term blockchain, they also attach this word blockchain technology to this and trying to make this a phrase. But in no sense, blockchain technology is just a particular way of encrypting data. And so that is really not that interesting if you think about this, right? So that's an incremental improvement to secure your database or your network. What the true innovation is that Bitcoin specifically introduced is that idea of having a decentralized stack that will allow you to then transfer value without needing to go back to another entity. So true peer-to-peer value transfer, which is not the case if you're just implementing blockchain technology, because then you're just securing your own database or network. So if you still have a centralized authority in the middle that can stop or change that particular transaction, you don't actually create what Bitcoin created, which is a digital bearer instrument. And that's where I guess we can come to the first slide of fungibility.
Yeah, so two forms of value are fungible and non-fungibility, fungibility, non-fungibility. And now I'll pull up the slide right now. So we'll start with the discussion of what is fungibility. I guess it could be in economic terms. So let me just make this full screen.
Yeah.
And then...
Yeah, so fungibility is typically something that's thought after in this old paradigm of money, right? So you don't care about the specific dollar note or $100 note in your pocket. You just care about the value that it represents, even though all of these are technically unique because they have a unique serial number. And same typically with some forms of commodity. Once in a while, you might care about your Coke can having a particular shape or design, but most of the time you're just consuming it, and so you're just interested in that particular content. So it's one product is interchangeable for the other one and generally accepted by everybody that's interested in acquiring that. And so the interesting part, though, to tie this together with what I was saying earlier, so your US dollar is your typical bearer instrument. And right now, there's less than 10% of all US dollars actually does exist in printed form because it's already all digital, right? But the value of having this particular fungible bearer instrument is I can give it to you, and simply by that particular act that I gave it to you, I don't have it anymore, right? So there's a true utility to that in that sense is this transaction is final. You walk away with this particular money. And this is what blockchain protocols enable you to do on a digital, in a digital way without having an intermediary attesting to the fact that I transfer that necessarily. And so this new term of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, if you want to move on to one of the next slides, is the idea that you want to be able to also do this with other things that are unique in nature or limited in nature. And that's the first slide. So, yeah, so I don't know if you want to talk about all the different crypto collectibles, but maybe just to touch on a few of those. So
yeah, we'll just cover a couple of them.
So the obvious one being that most people will probably have heard of is the CryptoKitties, which really was an expression of this new particular standard, the ERC 721, which most people will know in ERC 20, which is simply the token standard that interfaces with the Ethereum blockchain. So ERC 21 represents one particular entry on the Ethereum mainnet. And right now, the utility of that is somewhat limited because right now you can go to any Ethereum block explorer and you will see this particular PNG, and that's just courtesy of some of the block explorers. But none of the actual functions do exist right now on mainnet. What I mean by that is right now I can transfer this particular item that I own as a 721 token to you in a peer-to-peer fashion through any of the wallets that support this particular standard, which are pretty much all of them, I would assume, because it's a very useful utility to have. But none of the actual sidechain function, i.e. the breeding function, are being transferred at this point in time. But obviously, if you want to either move on or we can just, yeah. So obviously what got people very interested in this particular aspect is that there is people that assigned a lot of value to these non-fungible tokens just for its pure ownership, because in a digital form, this only exists once. And this is the one example where this one individual paid $140,000 at the time for this particular CryptoKitten. And part of this is that simply the CryptoKitty standard decided, okay, we're only going to produce new ones, generation O CryptoKittens for a short period of time. The period of time actually ended last Friday. Yeah, and that's Mr. Novogratz. For most people that follow this particular niche will know this particular phase. He was actually bidding on that same CryptoKitten. That's why I brought this up on that slide. And I think he stopped bidding at about 100,000 or so, but he still proclaimed afterwards he thinks it's going to be worth millions. I'm not so sure about that, but I think it's going to be other crypto collectibles that might be worth that.
Great. So before moving on, maybe can we cover some of the key differences between the standard ERC20 and the non-fungible ERC 721?
Yeah, so ERC20 is the default standard token contract, which most of the ICOs were conducted on over the past year and a half. It's super simple. It just lets you define how many tokens you want to generate, what you want to call them, and then you issue them to a particular wallet, and you determine how many increments there should be, and then you can basically start distributing these particular tokens. That's in a nutshell what an ERC20 is. It's an API, particular standard that talks with the Ethereum mainnet. So the difference between the evolution of that particular standard, so the ERC 721, is it lets you define one particular entry that represents one particular item on the Ethereum mainnet. So that means that it will also comply with the whole Ethereum ecosystem. So it will allow you to create wallets that all then comply with this particular standard at the end of the day, allowing me to send a CryptoKitten from my wallet that speaks this particular standard to your wallet that speaks this particular standard. Or if you want to sell this, there's already a couple of marketplaces that I list later that will also comply to this particular standard, to where these individual items then can be sold.
Great. So with the ERC20, all tokens are made equal. With 721, it's essentially one token, one assigned specific item. So why are non-fungibles? With CryptoKitties, it became so popular. Why is this a revolutionary thing? Why is there so much talk and discussion around non-fungibles?
Right. So I think a lot of people, including our team here, sees the real-world implementation of these particular standards. I have a lot of slides that speak to that in detail. Maybe we can fast forward to like the second to last. But the idea is that at the end of the day, a lot of real-world items that you have today, you want to be able to track. Along the supply chain. So if you want to go through the step by step, so if every item that is being issued was tracked on the blockchain, you could have a very auditable trail of how this item has been treated, who owned it, and if there's anything wrong with it, who you need to go back to. So the idea here being is I always call this an item should be born on the blockchain. So this first entry, if you look at this QR code, this will be your 721. So in our example that we made the other day, then we're attaching either this QR code to a real world item such as a wine, or in our example that we did the other day, we attached an NFC tag to that, which is a near frequency tool that also then complies with a lot of the standards that are already existing in your current smartphone, so that you can just hold this particular smartphone to this particular bottle and you see that particular entry on the blockchain. So if you then move forward, if you have this particular entry, you can sell the entry and the rights to this real world item by simply moving the entry, because a lot of times you might not actually want to move this wine. So we chose wine because there's a lot of facilities that already have certain characteristics that lend themselves for this particular tracking mechanism. So if you're a wine producer, then oftentimes what happens is you don't store this yourself, but you hand this over to a wine custodian or to a wholesaler. But there's truly wine custodians that will just hold onto these bottles, and you won't necessarily take delivery until and if you either want to consume it or you want to sell it to someone else. So it's not really useful to ship this bottle around if you could just actually transfer the ownership without doing so. In the past, that was mostly limited to certain database entries and to volume. So you would say, hey, I'm going to sell you 20 wine bottles of this particular year and this particular makeup. But if it comes down to it, you're probably also interested sometimes in particular bottles themselves. What I mean by this is, as soon as you come to rarer items, but also whether or not you want to track whether this particular item has been handled correctly, you want to be able to identify the individual item. So I'm using the Ethereum symbol there on top of this shape for this particular human to symbolize, hey, I can transfer the ownership rights to this particular real-world item on the Ethereum blockchain using the Ethereum public ecosystem. And then the next step, that's the symbol for IOTA, and IOTA particularly is trying to build blockchain solutions for things like Internet of Things and so forth. So if then this particular bottle is being moved from the original manufacturer into, let's say, this custodian in a warehouse, it may be of interest, obviously, whether or not this bottle was always handled in a particular way. Was it exposed to more than a certain temperature that is not conducive for the actual wine itself? Has it turned? And if I can attach this to the unique bottle, not to like generally any bottle in this particular warehouse, but to this particular bottle, you can see how this adds value once you move to the next step and you hand it over to, let's say, this is the symbol for Stella, to a point of sale system. Because if you check out at your local grocery store and you'll be able to actually move an entry that symbolizes the bottle that was born on the blockchain, that has been always tracked on a blockchain, and its provenance and how it's been treated, you could just simply click on an app, that's the last one, and see, hey, let's say I'm building an app using EOS, and it will also have an NFT standard that also interfaces with the initial born on the blockchain ERC 721 standard. You can simply click on this particular bottle entry and see, yes, it has always been kept at a certain temperature, and it was created at this particular winery on this particular date. These particular vendors held it. So if there's anything wrong with this, you could hopefully track it back, ideally, if everybody tweeted it correctly. And so other more useful things such as, hey, this is the last out of 1,000 bottles, and now this bottle by itself has more value, right? And this right now is basically impossible to do these things. Anyway, so that's kind of a very high-level summary, touching on a lot of things.
So the idea here is that one non-fungible token should be able to be transacted across different blockchains that can do a very specific thing that adds value.
Exactly. And obviously, we are just using the wine bottle here as an example. You can make up as many examples as you want. The other one that I touched on in a previous discussion was the idea that if you had auto parts, right, where every auto part is always being tracked as a unique piece in the supply chain, then if and when one of these pieces becomes faulty, you can actually pinpoint the particular vendor and or the particular batch that had this defect, rather than what's happening typically today is where everything gets recalled. Here in California, as you know, we just had a recall of certain types of salad, and all of a sudden there was no salad in any store, basically, because the manufacturers and the distributors were entirely unable to discern whether or not this was limited to a particular harvest. And so no one could buy salad, and all of this particular salad was, I guess, destroyed at this point in time, which is something you could prevent if you implement a very granular tracking system like this one. And you can make up many more examples like that.
Great. So people mostly know non-fungible tokens for serving a purpose in virtual items such as video games, or an example of CryptoKitties. And then there's exchanges that trade those virtual items. But this is a real world asset that's being tracked. So this right here, this is something that cannot be done at the moment, right? So this process that we have here on screen.
No, we have a couple of projects open right now where we work on those details. So in one of our next meetups, we will show the POS system that will do a lot of these pieces, and particularly will facilitate the payment channel on this, which we didn't talk about. Because then you can do a lot of interesting things in circumventing the hefty fees that are attached to using the merchant account systems, the legacy merchant account systems. And then also you can, in between those different item controllers, then decide who gets paid when, which right now is a big issue where there's a lot of third parties involved that take care of this particular part. But you could envision a scenario where, hey, the particular manufacturer gets actually paid at that point in time if and when this bottle gets consumed or bought by the end consumer, rather than everybody in the middle making a markup on the product itself. But yeah, you can make a lot of different examples here, but maybe we'll go back to what's possible right now. And this comes mostly down to what asset classes do we have. So a lot of times people use this term asset class somewhat indiscretionary right now, thinking of the whole kind of cryptocurrency idea as a new asset class. Cryptocurrency is a very small piece of blockchain paradigms, and it will probably only need a handful of those. Because at the end of the day, if you think about this, most currencies today are digital predominantly. The US dollar, more than 90% of US dollar only exists in digital form as zeros and ones in some databases. And it's a small step from there to make them actually blockchain native, right? So where they don't have to actually be issued by a central authority at this point in time. And the next step is something like a non-fungible token, to where you have individual items being born on the blockchain. So the real differentiation here is there's blockchain native assets. So in a narrow sense, that's your Bitcoin with a lowercase b. And in a narrow sense, those are items that are being created as ERC 721 standards. So but those are all already digital in nature, right? It's a small step to make them from their blockchain native, and that really allows you to transfer those items in a peer-to-peer fashion. For all other asset classes, what people are really talking about when they're talking about tokenization is really tokenizing the transfer mechanism. And that's why I'm referring to blockchain as a paradigm, mostly as a technology stack that lets you build value transfer protocols, because obviously in a real sense, you're not tokenizing wine, you're not tokenizing real estate, you're tokenizing the way you can transfer those. So you're tokenizing the way you can transfer the title to a house or to a car in the same way that you're transferring the ownership of a digital item. Whereas a digital item obviously is much easier, because once you just have that particular item, that's that. There's no additional steps involved. Whereas right now, for most real-world assets, you have got a lot of legacy databases that still need to be onboarded. And so that's, I think, the other important thing to understand. The real value right now, and what people should be focusing on, is building these on-ramps. A lot of times what we see is people trying to build platforms. Platforms is the old paradigm, right? Platform is your LinkedIn, your Facebook, your old world legacy systems that are trying to capture your data, that are trying to capture data about assets such as real estate, and then are rent seeking and provide access, right? So the typical example would be your multiple listing system, your MLS. All of those are data silos, not because the technology doesn't exist, because there's rent seeking entities that are interested in controlling this particular data. Anyway, let me shut up there, because as you know, I can go on tangents for an hour.
Great. So one of the main use cases in real world assets is transfer of ownership, because in today's transfer of ownership processes, a lot of times there's third parties involved. But something I wanted to get to next was different proposals for non-fungible tokens that add different features in addition to the standard ERC 721 that we all know. So the ERC 1155 standard somewhat quite well. So I was wondering if we can get to that discussion of what else is out there in terms of features for non-fungible tokens, and can you discuss a little bit about the ERC 1155 standard?
Yeah, so ERC 1155 is already part of mainnet, so you can already use it at this point in time, but is not officially moved as a standard yet by the organizing body. It will be shortly, it's our expectation, and we've been supporting it and promoting it for some time. And the way I like to describe it is it's a little limited item standard, to where sometimes you have the need to just create, let's say, 1,000 of a particular thing, i.e., the initial implementations right now that we're supporting are specific to in-game item sales, to where it's interesting to just create a limited number of, let's say, swords or of other in-game items, where a limited number of people will only be able to own those. And at that point in time, they, needless to say, have greater value. But same, coming back to the real world example, that's also a great standard then to use for things like your wine bottle, where you may only produce 20,000 bottles of a particular vintage and particular makeup. And so at that point in time, it's more conducive to have a limited item standard, where in between those bottles, they're interchangeable. You probably don't care initially which one you're getting, but you still know there's only 20,000 out from this particular one. So, and the reason why we're so excited about specifically the game implementation is because we can test a lot of standard optimizations and additional standard implementations in a game environment that would be very tough to do on mainnet if you have to go through the entire proposal process. And so the usual example for this that I make is, right now we got a lot of identity protocol suggestions out there, and a lot of players that kind of propose their own protocols and standards. And it's unlikely for any of those to be adopted at this point in time, because you can't just push these out as a real world implementation and expect everybody to start adhering to that before you actually know its eventual utility. In an in-game world, I can see what actually is useful, i.e., I can determine that my character should be male or female, has a certain ethnicity and so forth. And once you have the chance to play with this and see what people are interested in adopting, it's much easier from there, from those sidechain standards, to roll it out as a mainnet protocol proposal, because you already have a certain body of people that are used to this particular protocol, either in form of implementing it in the technology or simply as a user like me and you and me, that pick those particular items. And the interesting part, and that's what we're all waiting for, and in our case actively working towards too, is once you are able to control these identity items, you will make leaps and bounds progress on certain implementations that are now being developed on the mainnet. Might this be identity control wallets, where I can determine ahead of time that I'm a qualified buyer for, let's say, a security, or that I'm not, maybe I don't even have an identity. That's probably the most important problem to solve right now. There's 1 billion plus people that don't have an identity. So if you started this on a game world level, I think it provides a lot of utility to developers and a lot of utility to people that can just be exposed to this standard without being forced to use it for a real world implementation.
Good. So something that CryptoKitties in ERC 721 was known for nearly ago, it was for clogging the Ethereum network, and that was due because each CryptoKitty equaled one transaction. So there was a lot of transactions that were going through, and that causes gas to increase because each transaction requires gas. So is this an issue that 1155 solves for?
It is, because essentially what you can do is you could create 10,000 CryptoKitties in one batch. There will be one transaction. So whatever number you plug into that, and we'll simply create all of those individual addresses that then allow you and me to transfer one of those 10,000 to each other in a peer-to-peer fashion.
Great. And another thing that I was reading up upon, just wanted to clarify, is it also possible to do the transfer of both fungible and non-fungible tokens with the 1155?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you're talking about the specific wallets. So there's
okay.
on the slides right now that facilitate both standards at the moment.
Got it. And then what's Sustany's involvement with 1155? You said you guys are supporters of it. So what's the relationship between Sustany?
So we partnered with the team that came up with that particular standard. And so they have their own platform that lets specifically game developers create new in-game items that are born on the blockchain. And so we have a very tight partnership where we help new game developers to apply the standard and come up with an outline of how they're going to apply blockchain and the standard to their in-game development to make it more visible. So we'll sit down with them and tell them, okay, what's your expectation? What type of items will you create? And how will you create your new characters, for example? Like the one example that I always use is a hero could be born every hour, so that you would have one truly unique character being born once an hour that users could acquire. And also, I think what would be interesting for most game developers right now is test your game before you actually publish it. So by trying to just pre-sell some of those in-game items before you finish the game, right? It's a good indication to do a survey and ask, hey, would you be interested in playing this particular AAA game? It has these particular characters. It's a whole nother idea of selling those in-game items ahead of time. And with this particular platform, you can actually bake in tokens, right? So you can really create a residual value for these particular in-game items. So in essence, you always got the safety, hey, there's tokens that are built into this item, and this item itself is either rare or entirely unique, and because of that will probably increase in value. And if you see where game development is moving towards to right now, and as you know, we talked about this the other night, as this is bigger than Hollywood, it's bigger than the music industry, and bigger than the two combined, to where some very successful games right now have hundreds of millions of dollars a month in-game item sales. But the downside of these in-game items pre-blockchain is once this game goes away, meaning once those servers shut down, that you access by putting in your username and password and giving you access to your particular in-game character and to the items that you might have collected and the skills. Well, once the servers are down, then there goes your character, right? You lost it. And so now with this blockchain standard, you can avoid that. You can create characters and in-game items that you can truly own, that you can basically, quote unquote, carry around in your pocket. And if this particular game publisher comes out with a new game afterwards, they can allow you to use that same character that you developed maybe over several years in that new game. So that's part of the very unique scenario, and also will make it so that you can put it on a third-party platform that complies with this particular standard and actually sell it to another user, right? So it opens up a whole new level of ownership. And the example that probably resonates with most people that don't necessarily play online games is that of your MP3 files that you buy on iTunes, right? Before there was digital music rights management, there were CDs, right? You would buy a CD, and once you don't like it anymore, then you can sell it to someone else. You bought the CD for $20, and a year later you decide, I'm really tired of this particular album, let's sell it to someone else for $5, $10, and there were shops that were doing this. Well, with your digital rights management right now, if you download a song on, let's say, iTunes, you actually don't get full ownership. You get some form of digital right to it, and you can play it on 5 particular devices of your choosing, but you can't sell it to me, right? So you're stuck with that song. Now, with these new blockchain standards, you could actually do this. And my expectation is that you will see digital rights management move towards that, because at the end of the day, that's what you really want, right? You want true ownership, and you want to be able to sell this to someone once you are tired of this particular digital item, and or you just bought it for an increase in value. And this will also open up a whole new value stream for artists themselves, where they can build limited editions of, let's say, a song that they just recorded with one particular artist on one particular day, and there will be only true 10,000 copies that you can manage, that you can transfer, and everybody else will have an unauthorized copy. But the main point there is that you have a standard that will allow the actual artist and the actual user to interact directly with any wallet that complies to that standard. So that's very different from what's happening now, where most of the money is made by the intermediaries, right, by middlemen that maintain those platforms.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I'm sure we'll see new marketplaces emerge for those digital ownerships of different types of assets, and then going into the future, hopefully we get to see NFTs integrated with real world assets and being interoperable with different blockchains. So in your opinion, what's next for NFTs? What will it take, or where do you see NFTs going? Whether it's adoption from ERC 721 or ERC 1155, or NFTs on other blockchains. What will it take for adoption of NFTs to be sustainable?
Well, the one obvious thing is, and that was what I kind of left out on the graphic earlier, is outside of Ethereum, the other blockchains don't have NFT standards yet, and we only have the beginnings right now of interoperability standards that talk in between blockchains. So those need to be in place. I think the pull is going to come to where there's the most utility to be had initially, and so we're trying to identify some of the solutions that add immediate utility to the issuer right now. That's part of the reason why I picked the wine scenario. You can see the immediate utility for someone who maintains a winery, who only has a particular product that's only available during a certain period of time, that's limited in issuance, and that they now, in a very cumbersome way, typically have to market, right? There's a lot of intermediary involved that make money on their product, right? Whereas if I was to issue a 721 token for each bottle, you could let these marketplaces be generated instantly, right? And I could also market it directly to the consumer. That's the interesting part, right? So if I get actually a complete full circle insight in who is actually the consumer of my wine, which is super hard to do right now. But as a winery, if I know that you are the one that likes this particular bottle, right? If I can get that relationship done end to end from the point of sale system to where I'm now, then you're starting with, hey, I create this particular item on the blockchain, I put it out there, you can buy the rights to this particular bottle, you can take direct delivery, and you can allow anybody to build marketplaces around that without having the additional burden of needing to take delivery, put this on a truck, have to store this in a warehouse at a certain temperature, and then do a price finding. So that's what's happening right now in a very inefficient way, specifically in these type of niche commodity markets, right? It's very hard to determine what is this worth, right? You can only reach out to so many people before you have to get these bottles into the production, onto a shelf somewhere, right? You're not going to spend months trying to find out what's the right price for this particular bottle. Whereas if I have a digital representation that symbolizes a particular bottle as a collector or as someone who is a wholesaler, I can buy it at the particular point in time that it's being put online, right? Rather than here's a database, I'm going to share these database entries with a couple of wholesalers who then share with a couple of stores and so forth. No, you've got a particular standard that then as soon as you've got a couple of wineries complying with that, I think will become very interesting for everybody else because you're creating instant marketplaces. And so I think the driver will be by these type of scenarios, by people that are right now spending a lot of time trying to do price finding. And then at the end of the day, a lot of waste. So we got supply chain solutions where it's very hard to sometimes determine where has a mistake being made, where has something not being treated correctly, where was the original manufacturing error. So coming back to the car manufacturer example, if as a Honda, Toyota, whatever other car manufacturer, I would be able to pinpoint this particular production flaw, and I can limit it to only recalling 30 cars versus 3,000 cars. That's an enormous saving right off the bat. So I think we'll see a lot of these implementations happen here and there that will then pull a whole lot of other suppliers into this particular paradigm where they see, hey, yeah, that's really valuable. Oh, and by the way, my buyers will now require me to apply that because they want to be able to pinpoint their products in my supply chain.
Great, and we've already seen implementations of digital assets with gaming, and we'll start to see the emergence of implementations with real-world assets. So I hope you guys learned about non-fungible tokens and the different types of standards. So Christian, Sustany Capital hosts regular meetups in Orange County. Do you want to give a shout out where people can learn more about you, about the company, and about your meetups?
Yeah, sure. So we can be found at sustany.co. We do two things. We invest in blockchain-related startups and existing projects. We also help companies implementing blockchain technologies and blockchain solutions more specifically. And on an average basis, we host one meetup a month. If we have pertinent content, we try to make it very relevant. So we're going to do another meetup in January on the whole topic of security token offerings. And then we'll do a meetup in February on the topic of real-world implementations of blockchain solutions, where we'll showcase some of the point-of-sale systems that now use this particular paradigm, and that should be very interesting. So if you just look for Ethereum Meetup OC, it should be fairly easy to find if you're in Southern California.
Great. And for the viewers, I'll go ahead and add those links in the description down below. Be sure to stay tuned and subscribe to OST Live. We feature weekly guests from the industry to discuss the latest in blockchain. Next week, we have Mick Hagan, CEO of Mainframe, and we're available on YouTube Live weekly, and this gets reposted onto the podcast platforms anywhere you listen to podcasts. And we'll also have a recap of today's episode available on our Medium. Christian, thank you for joining us on OST Live.
Thanks for having me, Jose. Talk to you soon.